a black homeless man finds Messi's lost bag and decides to return it. This act leads to events that will change his fate forever. Subscribe to the channel and leave a comment where you watch this video from. The evening breeze swept through the streets of Miami, carrying with it the lingering energy of celebration. The city had come alive after yet another triumphant match for Inter Miami, with Lionel Messi at the heart of the victory. His decisive goal in the final minutes had electrified the crowd, and the post-match festivities spilled out into bars and restaurants, with fans clad in pink and black jerseys toasting their hero. Yet, amidst the cheers and flashing cameras, Messi felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over him. The stadium parking lot was packed with reporters, fans, and security personnel. Messi, used to the adulation, smiled politely, signed a few autographs, and then slipped into his car. His family was already at home waiting for him, but something about the night urged him to take a detour. He needed a moment of solitude, a chance to disconnect from the noise. Driving along the bayfront, he spotted a quiet park illuminated by soft, golden streetlights. It seemed like the perfect refuge. The park was serene, a stark contrast to the bustling city. Families were wrapping up picnics, joggers were winding down their routes, and the occasional cyclist pedaled lazily along the paths. Messi parked his car nearby, grabbed his sports bag, a small, nondescript black duffel, and strolled toward a secluded bench near the water. The gentle sound of waves lapping against the shore provided a soothing backdrop as he sat down, stretching his legs and letting out a deep sigh. His phone buzzed with a call from his agent, and he instinctively reached into the bag to grab it. The conversation was short but filled with reminders about his packed schedule: press appearances, sponsorship meetings, and training sessions. He nodded along, mentally noting each task before hanging up. Distracted by the call and his thoughts, he set the bag down beside him, leaning it against the bench. For a few moments, Messi allowed himself to simply exist in the quiet. He watched the city lights dance on the surface of the water, the noise of traffic fading into the distance, but his tranquility was fleeting. A group of teenagers on skateboards rolled by, their laughter echoing through the park, pulling him back to reality. Glancing at his watch, he realized it was getting late. His family would be waiting. Rising from the bench, he stretched once more and began walking back to his car, his mind already shifting to thoughts of home. He didn't notice the bag, still resting against the bench where he had left it. The drive home was uneventful, the city's vibrant energy now muted under the cover of night. By the time Messi pulled into his driveway, the house was dark except for the soft glow of the living room light. Inside, his wife greeted him with a smile, their children already asleep upstairs. He kissed her on the cheek and sank into the couch, relishing the quiet comfort of home. It wasn't until she handed him a glass of water and asked about his day that he realized something was wrong. He instinctively reached for his bag, only to feel his stomach drop as he remembered the bench in the park. "I left it," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Left what?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "My bag. At the park." The gravity of his mistake began to sink in. That bag wasn't just a collection of random items. It contained his personal documents, his wallet, keys, and an expensive watch gifted by a sponsor. His phone was in his pocket, but the loss of everything else could spiral into chaos. His wife's face mirrored his alarm as he explained the situation. "We need to go back," she urged, already reaching for her car keys. Messi hesitated. It was late, and the park might already be deserted. What if someone had taken it? What if it was gone? The questions swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. Still, he knew they had no choice. The drive back to the park felt agonizingly slow. His wife stayed silent, sensing his anxiety. When they finally arrived, the once bustling park was eerily still. Messi hurried to the bench where he'd sat earlier, his heart pounding in his chest. But the spot was empty. The bag was gone. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at the vacant bench as if willing the bag to reappear. His wife placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but it did little to calm his rising panic. He replayed the evening in his mind, searching for clues, but there was nothing. The realization hit him like a wave. His belongings, his privacy, everything in that bag was now in the hands of a stranger. As they drove back home, Messi's thoughts were a chaotic jumble of worry and regret. He could already envision the headlines if the bag fell into the wrong hands. Beyond the material loss, the potential invasion of his family's privacy was what troubled him the most. By the time they reached the house, his exhaustion had given way to a restless unease. That night, sleep eluded him. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening. Somewhere in the city, his bag was out there, its contents vulnerable to the unknown. And yet, in the heart of Miami, under the same moonlit sky, an unlikely series of events had already been set into motion, events that would forever change not just his life, but the life of someone he had yet to meet. Under the same moonlit sky, another life unfolded in sharp contrast to Messi's. A few blocks away from the luxurious stadium and glittering skyline, Jerome sat on a makeshift bed made of flattened cardboard and a blanket worn thin from years of use. The park was his home, though calling it that felt like a bitter joke. His corner, tucked away behind a cluster of bushes near the playground, offered a sliver of privacy. Tonight, like most nights, Jerome prepared to sleep under the stars, his stomach half full from a donated sandwich he'd picked up earlier. Jerome was a man of 54, his face etched with lines that told the story of a hard life. His deep-set eyes, once sharp and full of ambition, now carried a quiet resignation. His frame, tall and sturdy even in his current state, hinted at the strong and capable man he once was. Years ago, Jerome had worn a uniform, serving as a technician in the U.S. Army. He was proud of his work, maintaining equipment and solving problems in the field. But that life felt like a distant dream, blurred by the passage of time and the harsh realities that followed. When he returned home from service, the transition to civilian life was anything but smooth. Jobs were scarce, and the ones he found didn't last. A workplace injury left him with chronic pain and no savings to fall back on. The medical bills piled up, and soon the dominoes began to fall. His apartment, his car, his dignity. The final blow came when his wife, unable to bear the strain, took their daughter and left. Jerome hadn't seen or spoken to either of them in nearly a decade. Tonight, as he lay staring at the stars, memories of his daughter flickered in his mind. She would be in her 20s now, a young woman carving out her own path in the world. He wondered if she ever thought of him, if she even knew he was still alive. The thought stung, and he pushed it away, focusing instead on the cool breeze and the distant sound of waves lapping against the shore. It was then that he noticed something unusual. From his spot, Jerome saw a bag resting on a bench nearby. It was sleek and clean, clearly out of place in the park's usual clutter. Curious, he rose to his feet and approached cautiously, his steps silent on the soft grass. The bag looked expensive, its smooth black leather catching the dim glow of a nearby street lamp. Jerome hesitated. Abandoned belongings often came with trouble, and he'd learned the hard way to steer clear of anything that might bring the cops sniffing around. But something about this bag intrigued him. Kneeling beside it, he unzipped the main compartment. Inside, he found a wallet, a set of keys, a pair of designer sunglasses, and, his breath caught, a thick stack of cash. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen so much money in one place. For a moment, the world around him seemed to pause. His mind raced with possibilities. With that kind of money, he could rent a cheap motel room for weeks, maybe even months. He could buy new clothes, get a haircut, try to clean himself up and look for work. It was a lifeline dangling in front of him, almost too good to be true. But then his eyes fell on something else in the bag, a passport. He flipped it open and was immediately struck by the photo staring back at him. It was Lionel Messi. The name jumped off the page like a lightning bolt. Jerome knew who Messi was, of course. Everyone did. He was the man whose face adorned billboards and magazine covers, whose skill on the soccer field had earned him the adoration of millions. And now, his bag was here, in Jerome's hands. The realization hit him like a wave of cold water. This wasn't just any bag. It belonged to someone whose life was worlds apart from his own. Someone who had everything Jerome had lost, and more. For a long moment, Jerome just stared at the passport, his thoughts a chaotic jumble of envy, guilt, and confusion. He sat down on the bench, the bag still in his lap, and tried to think. The easy thing would be to take the cash and leave the rest. Messi probably wouldn't even notice a few $1,000s missing. But Jerome knew he couldn't do it, not because of the fear of getting caught, but because of something deeper, a sense of integrity that had somehow survived the years of hardship. Jerome had always prided himself on being a good man, even when life gave him every reason not to be. It was a principle instilled in him during his time in the army, a lesson about honor and doing the right thing, even when no one was watching. Slowly, he zipped the bag closed and placed it beside him. He didn't know how he would return it, or if anyone would even believe his story. A black man with nothing but the clothes on his back, walking into a police station with Messi's belongings, would almost certainly draw suspicion. But he had to try. He had to at least make the effort. Rummaging through the bag again, Jerome found a phone tucked into a side pocket. It was locked, but the notifications on the screen provided a clue. Several missed calls from a number labeled Antonella, a woman's name. He assumed it must be Messi's wife. With trembling fingers, Jerome tapped on the number and brought the phone to his ear. It rang twice before a soft, cautious voice answered. "Hello?" Jerome cleared his throat, his voice gravelly from disuse. Hi, my name's Jerome. I think I found your husband's bag." There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. You have it? Oh my God, where are you?" Jerome quickly explained his location, trying to ignore the disbelief in her tone. They agreed to meet at a nearby cafe the next morning. As he ended the call, a strange mix of relief and anxiety washed over him. He'd done the right thing, but what came next was uncertain. Returning to his spot behind the bushes, Jerome tucked the bag safely under his makeshift bed and lay down, staring up at the sky once more. His mind raced with questions. What kind of man would Messi turn out to be? Would he believe Jerome's story, or would he see him as just another desperate homeless person looking for a quick payout? Sleep came fitfully that night, as Jerome braced himself for what he hoped would be the start of a better chapter in his life, or at least a chance to prove, if only to himself, that he still had a shred of decency left. The cafe was quiet in the early morning, the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the crisp Miami air. Jerome stood outside, shifting nervously from one foot to the other, the bag held tightly in his hand. His worn clothes and unshaven face stood in stark contrast to the sleek, upscale setting. The patrons inside were oblivious to him, sipping their lattes and reading newspapers, but Jerome felt every eye on him as if he was a spectacle. He took a deep breath and walked to a corner of the entrance, trying to make himself invisible. He had barely slept, spending most of the night watching over the bag, fearing that something might go wrong before he could fulfill his promise. He had replayed the conversation in his mind repeatedly, wondering if Messi's wife had believed him or if they'd show up with police, ready to accuse him of theft. Yet, despite the doubts and anxiety, there was a small glimmer of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, this could lead to something good. Jerome didn't have to wait long. A black SUV pulled up to the curb, the tinted windows preventing him from seeing who was inside. The door opened, and Lionel Messi stepped out, instantly recognizable in a simple white t-shirt and jeans. Jerome's heart skipped a beat. He had seen Messi countless times on TV, in magazines, larger than life on billboards, but seeing him up close was something entirely different. He was shorter than Jerome imagined, but his presence filled the space around him with a quiet, understated authority. Messi's eyes scanned the entrance, and then they landed on Jerome, who gave a hesitant nod. Messi approached him, and for a second, Jerome almost backed away, unsure how to act around someone so far removed from his world. "Jerome?" Messi asked, his voice soft, his eyes kind. "Yeah," Jerome replied, his voice hoarse. I have your bag." He held it out with both hands, as if presenting something precious. Messi reached out and took it, and the look of relief that washed over his face was unmistakable. "Thank you," Messi said, his eyes meeting Jerome's, full of genuine gratitude. "You don't know how much this means to me." He glanced down at the bag, unzipping it quickly to check the contents, then looked back up. "Everything is here. You didn't take anything?" Jerome shook his head. "No, I couldn't. It wouldn't have been right." Messi paused, clearly touched by the honesty in Jerome's words. He gestured toward the cafe. "Can I buy you a coffee? Please, I'd really like to thank you properly." Jerome hesitated. Everything about the situation felt surreal. He was standing face to face with Lionel Messi, and now the man wanted to buy him a coffee? He glanced at the cafe, where people were still oblivious to their conversation, and felt the weight of his tattered clothes and weary appearance. "I don't think I belong in a place like this," he muttered. "Nonsense," Messi replied with a gentle smile. "Everyone belongs wherever they are welcome, and you're more than welcome." There was something disarming about Messi's demeanor. He wasn't flashy, wasn't trying to show off. He was simply being kind. Jerome nodded slowly, and together they stepped inside. The barista greeted Messi with wide eyes, clearly recognizing him, but Messi quickly gestured to Jerome, indicating that he was the one to be served first. "Whatever you'd like, it's on me," he said. Jerome, feeling more nervous than he'd like to admit, ordered a simple black coffee, while Messi got a cappuccino. They found a table near the back, away from the curious stares of the other customers. For a few moments, they sat in silence, the tension palpable. Jerome stared down at the steaming cup of coffee, unsure of how to start a conversation. It was Messi who finally broke the silence. "So, Jerome, I want to understand. he began, his voice gentle but curious. "You found the bag and decided to return it. Why?" Jerome sighed, setting his cup down. "I guess it's the way I was raised," he said. "My mom used to say, 'Do the right thing, even when it's hard.' I've tried to live by that, though it hasn't always been easy." He paused, glancing up to meet Messi's eyes. "I've lost a lot in my life, my job, my family, my home, but I didn't want to lose my sense of right and wrong, too. That bag, it wasn't mine, and keeping it wouldn't have made my life better. Not really." Messi listened intently, his expression softening as Jerome spoke. It was clear that there was more to Jerome than his outward appearance, a depth and dignity that hadn't been crushed by his circumstances. Messi nodded, his eyes filled with empathy. "You know, Jerome, a lot of people wouldn't have done what you did," Messi said. "They'd have seen the money, the opportunity, and they would have taken it without a second thought. The fact that you didn't says a lot about you." He paused, taking a sip of his cappuccino. "I want to help you, if you'll let me." Jerome looked up, taken aback. "Help me? How?" "Well, first, let's start with something immediate," Messi said. He reached into his bag and pulled out an envelope, placing it on the table between them. "There's some cash in here, enough to help you get back on your feet for a while. It's not charity, it's my way of thanking you for your honesty." Jerome hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the envelope. He had spent years refusing handouts, trying to hold on to the scraps of pride he had left, but there was something different about this. It wasn't pity, it was genuine gratitude. Slowly, he nodded, taking the envelope. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Messi smiled, the warmth in his expression unmistakable. "It's the least I can do, but I want to do more. Tell me, what do you need? A place to stay? A job? I have connections. I can make some calls." Jerome blinked, struggling to process the words. A place to stay? A job? It all seemed too good to be true. He shook his head slightly, his emotions a mix of disbelief and hope. I don't even know where to start," he admitted. "I've been on the streets for so long, I don't know what it's like to live a normal life anymore." "Then let's start small," Messi suggested, his tone kind but firm. "We'll take it one step at a time. I know a few people who work with veterans. Maybe they could help you find something. And in the meantime, I can help you get a roof over your head." Tears pricked at the corners of Jerome's eyes, and he quickly looked down, blinking them away. He hadn't felt this kind of hope in years, hadn't believed that anyone would ever extend a hand to help him up. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't know me. I'm just some guy from the street." Messi smiled softly. "Because I believe in people. I've been fortunate in my life, and I think it's important to give back when I can. You did the right thing when no one was watching, and that deserves to be acknowledged. Besides," he added with a small chuckle, "you saved me a lot of trouble. My wife would have killed me if I lost all my documents." Jerome laughed, the sound surprising even to him. It was a genuine laugh, the first in what felt like forever. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to believe that maybe things could change, that maybe, just maybe, he could find his way back to the man he once was. As they finished their coffee, Messi exchanged contact information with Jerome, assuring him that he would be in touch soon. They stepped out of the cafe together, the sun, now fully risen, bathing the park in golden light. Jerome watched as Messi got back into the SUV, waving one last time before the car pulled away. Jerome stood there for a moment, the envelope still clutched in his hand, the warmth of the encounter lingering. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in years it didn't seem quite so bleak. The Miami sky was a crisp blue as Jerome found himself standing at the entrance of a downtown office building, a mix of nerves and hope bubbling inside him. It had been a few days since he'd met Lionel Messi at the cafe, and, true to his word, Messi had reached out, connecting Jerome with a local foundation that helped veterans reintegrate into society. The Veterans Aid Network, they called it, and today he had a meeting with one of their representatives. Jerome's heart pounded as he stepped through the automatic doors, the cold rush of air conditioning hitting his face. The lobby was bustling with people in business attire, and Jerome couldn't help but feel out of place. His clothes were clean. Messi had even arranged for him to get a new set, but they were simple and didn't match the polished look of the office workers. As he approached the reception desk, he cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. Hi, I'm Jerome. I have an appointment with—" He glanced at the small piece of paper in his hand. "With Mr. Anderson at the Veterans Aid Network." The receptionist smiled warmly. "Of course, Mr. Jerome. You can take a seat over there, and Mr. Anderson will be right with you." Jerome nodded, offering a hesitant smile in return. He walked over to the waiting area and sank into one of the chairs, his mind racing. This was an opportunity he never thought he'd have again. A chance to rebuild, to put the pieces of his life back together. But for every ounce of hope, there was also fear. What if they couldn't help him? What if they took one look at him and decided he wasn't worth the effort? A few minutes later, a door opened, and a tall man in his late 40s, dressed in a smart suit, stepped into the lobby. He scanned the room until his eyes fell on Jerome. "Mr. Jerome," he called out, his voice warm and welcoming. Jerome stood, his legs feeling a bit unsteady. "Yeah, that's me." The man approached, extending his hand. "I'm Tom Anderson. It's a pleasure to meet you. Lionel spoke very highly of you." Jerome shook his hand, a hint of surprise flickering in his eyes. "He did?" Tom nodded. "He did. Said you were one of the most honest people he'd ever met. Why don't we go into my office? We can talk more comfortably there." Jerome followed Tom down a corridor and into a modest office. There were framed pictures on the wall, images of Tom shaking hands with veterans, group photos of community events, and certificates of appreciation. Jerome found a seat as Tom settled behind his desk. "So, Jerome," Tom began, leaning forward, "Lionel told me a bit about your story. I know it hasn't been easy for you, and I want you to know that you're not alone. We're here to help, and we're going to do whatever we can to get you back on your feet. But I'd like to hear your story from you. Can you tell me how you ended up where you are?" Jerome sighed, his eyes drifting to the window for a moment before returning to Tom. He took a deep breath. "It's a long story, Mr. Anderson. I served in the Army as a technician. I was proud of that job. It gave me a purpose. But when I came back home, things weren't the same. I struggled to find work, and the jobs I did get, they didn't last. Then there was an injury. Nothing dramatic, but enough to keep me from holding on to the more physical jobs. The bills piled up, and before I knew it, I was out of a home, out of a family. I've been on the streets for years now." Tom listened intently, nodding, his expression compassionate. "I understand, Jerome. What you went through isn't uncommon. We hear similar stories from veterans all the time. The system isn't always kind to people like you, people who've given so much and ask for so little in return. Jerome swallowed hard, emotions welling up as Tom spoke. There was something validating about being heard, about having someone recognize the struggles he'd faced instead of just looking at him like a lost cause. "We have a few programs that I think might be a good fit for you," Tom continued. "We can start by getting you a more permanent place to stay, a room in one of our transition houses. From there, we can work on job training. You mentioned you were a technician in the Army, right? Those skills are still valuable. We can help you get recertified, maybe even find a position in maintenance or technical support." The words washed over Jerome like a balm, soothing years of accumulated hopelessness. He nodded, a shaky smile forming. That would mean everything to me. I want to work. I want to be able to take care of myself again." Tom smiled back. "Good. That's exactly the kind of attitude we need. This won't be easy, Jerome. It's going to take time and there will be challenges, but we're here to help you through every step of the way. You've already taken the hardest step, asking for help." Jerome left the office that day with a new sense of purpose. It was strange, almost uncomfortable, to feel hope again after so many years of numbness. As he stepped back onto the bustling streets of Miami, he allowed himself a moment to take it all in. The sun was bright, and the city, which had always seemed indifferent to his struggles, now felt a little less hostile. Days turned into weeks, and the transformation began. Jerome moved into a small room in a transitional housing facility, a modest space with a bed, a desk, and a window that let in the morning light. It wasn't much, but it was his, and that made all the difference. He attended meetings at the Veterans Aid Network, worked with a counselor to start addressing his trauma, and enrolled in a course to refresh his technical skills. The work was hard, often exhausting, but it felt good to be moving forward. One of the toughest challenges was navigating the bureaucratic hurdles that came with reestablishing his identity. He had lost all of his identification years ago, and without it, finding stable employment was nearly impossible. Tom and the team at the foundation helped him fill out the paperwork, stood by him at the DMV, and advocated for him with government offices. Each form, each visit, was a reminder of how much he had lost, but also of how much he was slowly regaining. Despite the progress, not everything was smooth sailing. One afternoon, as Jerome sat in the crowded waiting room of a government office, a weary bureaucrat barely looked up from her computer before dismissing him. "We don't have your records, sir. You'll need to come back another time." The words stung, the indifferent tone cutting deep, and Jerome felt the old hopelessness creeping back. He wanted to argue, to shout, to demand that someone, anyone, see him as a person, not just another file. But before he could say anything, Tom stepped in, his voice firm but polite. "There must be something you can do. My friend here has been trying to get his paperwork sorted for months now. He served his country, and he deserves more than just another dismissal." The woman hesitated, glancing up at Tom, then at Jerome, as if seeing him for the first time. With a sigh, she nodded and began typing again. The tension in Jerome's chest eased, and he shot Tom a grateful look. It was a small victory, but it mattered. News of Jerome's journey started to spread, partly because of Messi's involvement. The media had initially been skeptical, some outlets calling it a PR stunt and questioning Messi's motives. Jerome hated the attention. He didn't want to be seen as some charity case. But as more and more people heard his story, about his honesty, about Messi's support, about the Veterans Aid Network, the narrative began to change. People reached out to offer help, donations came in for the foundation, and Jerome found himself becoming something he never expected, a symbol of hope. One morning, Jerome received a call from a number he didn't recognize. On the other end was a voice that he hadn't heard in years, a young woman's voice, hesitant, almost disbelieving. "Dad?" His heart nearly stopped. "Kira?" he whispered, his throat tightening with emotion. "Yeah," she replied, her voice cracking. I saw your story online. I didn't know if it was really you, but I had to try." Tears welled in Jerome's eyes, and he struggled to find the words. He had imagined this moment so many times, had dreamt of it, but now that it was happening, he felt overwhelmed. "It's me, sweetheart. It's really me." There was a pause, and then Kira spoke again, her voice softer. "I've missed you, Dad." Jerome wiped at his eyes, a smile breaking through his tears. "I've missed you too, Kira, more than you could ever know." The call was short, both of them too overwhelmed to say much, but they agreed to meet. As Jerome hung up, he felt something inside him shift. Something that had been broken for years was starting to heal. His meeting with Kira took place in a small diner on the outskirts of Miami. She was older now, her hair shorter, her eyes a little more guarded, but she was still his little girl. The moment she walked in, Jerome stood, his breath catching in his throat. She approached slowly, and then, without a word, she wrapped her arms around him, holding him tight. Jerome closed his eyes, his heart swelling with a mix of joy and sorrow. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you." Kira pulled back, her eyes glistening with tears. "It's okay, Dad. You're here now, and that's what matters." For the first time in years, Jerome allowed himself to believe in the possibility of a future where he wasn't defined by his past mistakes, but by the love he still had to give and the hope that now burned brightly inside him. It wouldn't be easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long time, Jerome felt ready to face them. With the support of the people around him and the rekindled connection with his daughter, he was determined to build a new life, one step at a time. The sound of city life greeted Jerome every morning as he stepped out of the transitional housing facility. Miami bustled with its usual frenetic energy, cars honking, people chatting as they walked hurriedly to their destinations, and the distant noise of construction echoing through the air. But for Jerome, everything felt different now. For once, he wasn't an observer of this life. He was becoming a part of it again. It had been a few weeks since Jerome had moved into his new place, a modest room with a clean bed, a small kitchenette, and, most importantly, a door that locked. It wasn't much compared to the homes he'd had in the past, but it was more than he could have imagined just a month ago. The first morning, he woke up in the room, sunlight streaming through the small window. He had sat at the edge of the bed, tears welling up as he let the reality of it sink in. He had a home. Not a temporary shelter, not a bench in a park, but a real, honest-to-God place where he could be himself. Jerome's days had quickly filled up. Between his part-time job at a local maintenance company and the recertification classes he attended at the Veterans Aid Network, he had little time for anything else. The maintenance job was simple but honest work, and it made Jerome feel useful again. Fixing things, solving practical problems, it reminded him of his time in the Army, where his role had always been about keeping things running smoothly, whether it was machinery or morale. Jerome worked alongside another veteran named Carlos, a younger man with an easy smile and an infectious laugh. The two bonded over shared experiences, both the good and the bad, and their friendship quickly became a source of strength for Jerome. They worked on repairing elevators, fixing HVAC units, and making sure everything ran as it should. Each day brought new challenges, but Jerome welcomed them. He felt his confidence slowly returning, his body growing stronger from the physical labor, his mind sharper. One afternoon, as Jerome and Carlos sat in their company van during a lunch break, Carlos turned to him with a grin. "You know, Jerome, you're like some kind of celebrity now." Jerome raised an eyebrow, taking a bite of his sandwich. "Oh, yeah? What makes you say that?" Carlos chuckled, pulling out his phone and showing Jerome a news article. It was one of the many stories that had been written about his journey, how he had found Lionel Messi's bag and returned it, how Messi had helped him get back on his feet. Jerome's picture, taken at a Veterans Aid Network event, was splashed across the screen. "They're saying you're a hero," Carlos said, nudging him playfully. "What do you think about that?" Jerome shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think people like to make things bigger than they are," he said. "I'm no hero, Carlos. I just did what anyone should have done." Carlos nodded, but his eyes held a glint of respect. "Maybe. But not everyone would have done it, you know. That's what makes it special." Jerome didn't know how to respond to that, so he simply nodded and went back to his lunch. It was still strange for him to think that people saw him as anything other than just a guy trying to survive. But maybe Carlos was right. Maybe there was something special about doing the right thing, even when it seemed like no one else would. Beyond the work and classes, Jerome had been focused on reconnecting with his daughter, Kira. Their first meeting at the diner had been emotional and raw, but it had also been a start. Since then, they had met a few more times, sometimes for a coffee, sometimes for a walk along the waterfront. Each time, the awkwardness seemed to lessen, the years of separation slowly giving way to a new, tentative bond. One Saturday morning, Jerome sat at a small cafe waiting for Kira. He was early, as usual, the nervous anticipation making it impossible for him to stay in his room. He sipped his coffee, his eyes scanning the people passing by on the street, until he finally saw her. She was wearing a light blue dress, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail. She looked so much like her mother that it took Jerome's breath away. "Hey, Dad," she said as she approached the table, her smile bright and genuine. Jerome stood, giving her a hug before they both sat down. "Hey, sweetheart, how have you been?" They talked about little things, her job at a local marketing firm, a new book she was reading, the upcoming music festival she was excited to attend. Jerome listened, savoring every detail. He loved hearing her voice, loved knowing that she was letting him back into her life. At one point, she hesitated, her gaze dropping to her cup of tea. "Dad, can I ask you something?" "Of course," Jerome said, his heart skipping a beat. Do you think we could try to get together more often? Maybe even meet Mom sometime?" She looked up, her eyes full of hope and uncertainty. Jerome swallowed, his throat tight. The question took him by surprise, but he could see how much it meant to her. He reached across the table, placing his hand over hers. "I'd love that, Kira. I'd love to meet your mom again, if she's okay with it. I want to be here for you now, in any way I can." Kira's eyes glistened with tears and she nodded. "Thanks, Dad. That means a lot to me." As they parted that day, Jerome felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. The possibility of seeing his ex-wife again, of trying to rebuild something even if just a friendship, felt daunting, but he was willing to try. For Kira, for himself. It wasn't all easy, though. There were days when Jerome's past would weigh heavily on him. One particularly difficult night, he sat alone in his small room, the memories of everything he had lost rushing back. His wife, his home, his pride. The fear that he might not be able to hold on to this new life gnawed at him. He picked up his phone, almost calling Tom or Carlos just to hear a friendly voice, but instead he closed his eyes and took a deep breath. He reminded himself of how far he had come, of the progress he had made. He wasn't the same man he had been a month ago, or even a week ago. He was stronger now. The following morning, Jerome woke early and decided to go for a run. It had been years since he had done anything like that, but he needed to clear his mind. The early Miami air was cool, the streets still quiet. He jogged along the waterfront, his legs protesting at first, his breath coming in short bursts, but he kept going, pushing himself a little further, a little harder. And as the sun began to rise over the horizon, casting its golden light over the city, Jerome felt a sense of freedom. He was running towards something, not away from it. One day, Messi called Jerome, asking if he wanted to come to a game as his guest. Jerome was taken aback by the offer, the thought of being in the spotlight again making him nervous. But Messi insisted, his voice kind but persuasive. "I want people to see what you've accomplished, Jerome. You deserve it." The day of the match, Jerome found himself at the stadium, his heart pounding as he walked through the VIP entrance. It felt surreal. Just weeks ago he had watched games like this from a distance, never imagining he'd be here, as a guest of the man who had helped turn his life around. A stadium official led him to his seat, and Jerome was greeted by Messi himself, who smiled warmly and hugged him. "It's good to see you," Messi said, guiding Jerome to a seat near the front. "I want you to enjoy tonight." As the game began, Jerome found himself swept up in the energy of the crowd, the cheers and chants reverberating through the stadium. It was a tight match, with Inter Miami playing with everything they had. Jerome watched in awe as Messi danced across the field, his skill and precision unmatched. The crowd roared as Messi scored the winning goal, and Jerome found himself cheering along with everyone else, a wide smile on his face. At halftime, an announcement came over the loudspeaker, and Jerome was startled to hear his own name. The announcer spoke of his journey, how he had found Messi's bag and returned it, how he had turned his life around with the help of the Veterans Aid Network. Jerome looked up, stunned, as the stadium's massive screen displayed his picture. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jerome felt tears prick his eyes. He stood, waving awkwardly, and Messi gave him a thumbs up from the field. In that moment, Jerome felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. Not the kind of pride that came from wealth or possessions, but the pride of knowing he had faced his demons, had chosen the harder path, and had come out the other side stronger. The pride of knowing that his story had inspired others, that maybe, just maybe, he could be the hero Carlos had once joked about. As the game ended, Jerome made his way down to the field where Messi and the rest of the team were celebrating. Messi wrapped an arm around his shoulders, pulling him in for a photo, the crowd still cheering. "You did good, Jerome," Messi said, his voice barely audible over the noise. "You should be proud of yourself." Jerome nodded, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, Lionel, for everything." Messi smiled. "This is just the beginning. Keep going, Jerome. You've got a lot more to do." Jerome left the stadium that night feeling lighter than he had in years. He knew there were still challenges ahead, there always would be, but he also knew he wasn't alone. He had friends, he had family, and he had a future. And for the first time in a long time, he looked forward to every single day that was yet to come. It was a crisp, bright afternoon in Miami, the kind of day that seemed almost custom-made for a big event. The sun was high in the sky, casting warm golden light over the city. People gathered in droves, eager to see Lionel Messi and the rest of the Inter Miami team play. But today was different. It wasn't just about the soccer match. It was about something bigger, something that had begun weeks ago with a small act of honesty. Jerome stood in front of his mirror, adjusting the collar of his shirt. It was a new shirt, clean, neatly pressed, and well-fitting. He looked at himself for a long time, as if trying to reconcile the man he saw with the person he used to be. He still bore the signs of a tough life. His face was lined, his hands rough from years of hardship, but his eyes were different now. They held hope, determination, and pride, a sense of dignity that hadn't been there for years. Jerome took a deep breath and nodded to himself. Today was going to be a big day. The match at the stadium that afternoon had an electric atmosphere, and the fans were louder than ever. Jerome had been invited once again as Messi's guest, but today he was more than a spectator. Today, Messi had asked him to come onto the field. Jerome wasn't used to being in the spotlight. It made him nervous, the thought of thousands of eyes on him. But Messi had insisted, and something in his tone made Jerome want to trust him. Arriving at the stadium, Jerome was led to a private box where he could watch the game before the big moment. He looked out over the massive field, the stands filled with excited fans, waving flags and cheering as the players warmed up. It was a sea of colors, pink, black, and white, all blurring together in celebration. Jerome found himself smiling, caught up in the energy of it all. He could hardly believe that just a few weeks ago he had been watching games like this from a bench in a park, hidden away from the world. And now, here he was, part of it. The match began, and Jerome watched in awe as Messi worked his magic on the field. The way he moved, the way he controlled the ball, it was pure artistry. The crowd roared every time Messi made a play, and Jerome felt a sense of pride, not just in the player, but in the person. Messi had seen something in Jerome, had reached out to help, and Jerome would be forever grateful. At halftime, Jerome was escorted down to the field. His heart was pounding as he stepped onto the grass, the bright lights of the stadium shining down on him. He could hear the low murmur of the crowd, wondering what was going on. Messi jogged over, a big grin on his face, and placed a reassuring hand on Jerome's shoulder. "You ready?" Messi asked, his eyes kind and encouraging. Jerome nodded, though his voice was caught in his throat. He took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of Messi's confidence settle his nerves. Messi turned to the crowd, raising a microphone to his lips. The noise in the stadium began to die down as Messi's voice echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying a warmth that immediately commanded attention. "Today is about more than just soccer. Today, we want to recognize someone who embodies the values we should all strive for: honesty, integrity, and kindness." Messi gestured to Jerome, who took a small step forward, feeling his heart pounding in his chest. "This is Jerome," Messi continued, his smile never wavering. "A few weeks ago, Jerome found my bag. He could have taken everything and disappeared. But instead, he chose to do the right thing. He returned it, with everything intact, expecting nothing in return. And that's the kind of character that we need more of in this world. The crowd was silent for a moment, and then the applause began. It started slowly, but grew, the sound swelling and filling the entire stadium. Jerome felt tears well up in his eyes as he looked around, seeing thousands of people standing, clapping for him. It was overwhelming. The noise, the emotion, the sheer weight of the moment. Messi handed Jerome the microphone, giving him an encouraging nod. Jerome hesitated, staring at the crowd. He had never been good with words, especially in front of so many people, but he knew he had to say something. Hi everyone," Jerome began, his voice shaky. He took a breath, trying to steady himself. I'm not used to this kind of attention. Honestly, I didn't do anything special. I just did what I thought was right. I think we all need to remember that doing the right thing matters, even if no one is watching." He paused, his eyes scanning the sea of faces before him. "I lost a lot in my life. My job, my home, my family. But I realized that even when you lose everything, you still have a choice. You can choose to hold on to what makes you a good person. I'm just glad that I was able to make that choice." The crowd erupted into applause again, and Jerome felt a smile tug at his lips. He handed the microphone back to Messi, who clapped him on the back. "Thank you, Jerome," Messi said, his voice filled with warmth. "You're an inspiration to all of us." Jerome waved at the crowd, feeling a mix of pride and humility. As they left the field, Messi leaned in close, his voice just loud enough for Jerome to hear. "You did great, my friend. I'm proud of you." Jerome smiled, his eyes still wet with unshed tears. "Thank you, Lionel. I never imagined something like this could happen to me." Messi grinned. "Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it?" The rest of the match passed in a blur for Jerome. He returned to his seat, his heart still pounding from the rush of emotions. As he watched Messi and his teammates play, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. The small choices, the moments of doubt, the unexpected kindness of strangers. Each moment had led him here, to a stadium filled with people, celebrating not just a game, but the spirit of human decency. After the game, Jerome was invited to join Messi and the team for a small celebration in one of the stadium's private lounges. The atmosphere was relaxed, filled with laughter and camaraderie. Jerome stood back at first, unsure if he belonged among these world-famous athletes. But Messi wouldn't hear of it, pulling Jerome into the circle, introducing him to his teammates. "You're part of this now, Jerome," Messi said, a warm smile on his face. "You're part of the family." Jerome couldn't help but smile. The word family meant more to him now than it ever had. He thought of Kira, of the tentative bond they were rebuilding. He thought of Carlos, who had become a trusted friend and confidant. And he thought of Tom and the people at the Veterans Aid Network who had believed in him when he couldn't believe in himself. The night wore on, and eventually Jerome found himself sitting at a table with Messi, sharing a quiet moment amidst the celebration. Messi leaned back, his eyes thoughtful. "You know, Jerome, this isn't the end," he said. "This is just the beginning for you. There's so much more you can do, so many people you can inspire." Jerome nodded, a soft smile on his face. "I used to think my life was over," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But now, I see that it's just beginning. I want to help others, Lionel. People like me, people who've lost their way. If I can inspire even one person, if I can help someone the way you helped me, then everything I went through will have been worth it." Messi smiled, his eyes filled with respect. "And you will, Jerome. You've already started." As the evening drew to a close, Jerome left the stadium, the cool night air washing over him. He walked slowly, savoring the moment, the lights of the stadium fading behind him. For the first time in a long time, Jerome felt a sense of purpose. He had faced his darkest moments, and now he was stepping into the light. The next morning, Jerome returned to the Veterans Aid Network, ready to begin the next phase of his journey. He had spoken with Tom about becoming a volunteer, about giving back to the community that had given him so much. He wanted to share his story, to let others know that even when everything seems lost, there is always hope. Tom greeted him warmly as he walked through the door. "You're ready for this?" Tom asked, his eyes searching Jerome's. Jerome smiled, a quiet confidence radiating from him. "More than ever." Tom clapped him on the back. "Good. We could use someone like you, a man who knows what it means to fight and never give up." Jerome spent the next few weeks training as a volunteer, learning how to counsel others, how to share his story in a way that could inspire and uplift. It wasn't always easy. There were times when the pain of his past would resurface, when the weight of his memories threatened to drag him down. But Jerome had learned how to face those moments, how to push through and find the strength to keep going. One day, as Jerome sat with a young veteran who had recently become homeless, he found himself sharing his own journey, about the park bench, the lost bag, and the unexpected friendship that had changed everything. The young man listened, his eyes wide, a flicker of hope appearing where there had once been only despair. "Do you really think I can make it?" the young man asked, his voice trembling. Jerome nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I know you can. It won't be easy, and there will be days when you want to give up, but you're stronger than you think, and you're not alone. None of us are." The young man smiled, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you, Jerome. I needed to hear that." As Jerome left the Veterans Aid Network that evening, he felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. He was no longer just a survivor. He was a guide, a mentor, a beacon of hope for those still lost in the darkness. His journey had come full circle, and yet it was just beginning. Jerome knew there would always be challenges, always be obstacles to overcome. But now, he faced the future with courage and determination, knowing that he had the strength to rise above whatever came his way. And as he looked out at the setting sun, painting the Miami skyline in hues of orange and pink, Jerome smiled, ready to embrace whatever tomorrow might bring. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Share this video with your friends. Maybe it will inspire them too. Also, watch other videos on our channel. We have many interesting stories that can touch you.